I appreciate we're recording. However, I just want to confirm, Ron, will you be saying the initial hellos and I'll be introducing Gary?
Yes, that's fine. I'll do that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar from the Edinburgh Napier Business School. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Andrew Bratton, from the HR team at the Business School to do our formal introduction to today's host, Dr. Gary Kildare. Andrew, if I could hand across to you.
Thank you, Ron. It's a pleasure for me to introduce you to Dr. Gary Kildare. Dr. Kildare is the Chief HR Officer for Europe and the Global Head of Labour Relations for the IBM Corporation. He is based in Madrid at the European headquarters and is a member of IBM's Acceleration Team, a group of senior executives appointed to provide global leadership across key strategic areas. He was awarded an honorary doctorate by Edinburgh Napier University 8 years ago and has spent most of his career at IBM, previously holding positions in Paris and New York. Today's session will focus on trends in business 2020 and beyond, and consider the future of HR and how it will be shaped by artificial intelligence and cognitive thinking. His guest session today will also focus on some ways in which business leaders can respond to the challenges of artificial intelligence. As people have questions today, could you please add them to the chat function? We will be recording today's session, and it will be hosted on Edinburgh Business School's website, and you will be sent the link after today's session. If you could kindly, if I could remind you to keep your microphone off during the session. So thank you, Gary, for joining us today. It is a great pleasure for us to host you as the first speaker in our new series of business school webinars with business leaders and alumni. To start off, we'll start with the first question of today's session. So the first question is, we have seen the UK government call for a return to workplaces, but many banks and other large employers have indicated that many staff will continue to work from home for the foreseeable future. From your international perspective, how do you see the world of work evolving in the shadow of COVID-19 before and after a vaccine?
Well, Andrew and Ron, thank you very much for your introductions and warm welcomes. It's a pleasure for me to have the chance to talk to everyone on the webinar today, and for this to be your first one. So, many great pleasures to do so. COVID-19 is something that this time last year none of us had ever heard about, or perhaps even thought about. And yet it's had such a profound impact, not just on business, but also on our daily lives as citizens. The way we do things, the way we go about our business, it's had a huge impact on travel and on industry, and I'm very sure that instead of a webinar, pre-COVID, we would probably be doing this in person in Edinburgh and having a chance to see each other, meet each other, and shake hands. So the word that's been most used around this has been the word unprecedented. And we seem to be in a succession of unprecedented impacts and activities. Before I get into the question of how are businesses responding and coming back to workplaces, it's maybe worthwhile just to set a little bit of the kind of economic context. The first that I would say here is, and just to use a very fast number, one of the articles I read in the early days of COVID was talking about businesses, average businesses, having no more than £16,000 worth of cash at hand. And once they burned through that cash, they were then in trouble as to how they were going to keep their business going and keep it afloat. So I just wanted to talk maybe first of all about the impacts on business, on large and on small, and how cash flow is going to be one of the largest problems and remain one of the problems for some foreseeable time. Because it's not just the issue of keeping my business open, but it's also about payments to other businesses, payments in supply chains, some small businesses being out of money and needing money to keep themselves going. So it's a huge issue, really short and long term. And without shoring up the delivery of cash across the economy, we're going to see many businesses that are actually failing. And this is going to constrain competition, it's going to constrain growth as the economy recovers. So it used to be that the statements were about cash flow or cash being king. I think it's going to be emperor and president as well as we move forward. And to create a kind of healthier business environment, I think, is going to mean that businesses need to take a more partner-centered approach to suppliers rather than just a transactional one. And what I have seen is the whole supply chain being disrupted and then having to be rapidly rebuilt in order that businesses are going to be able to survive. Right. The second area to reference is probably technology, and to say that, if you look back over the last 5 or 10 years, many businesses have been making what would be called their digital journey. The ones that have made that journey completely, or the ones that are on the road to doing so, are much more likely to be able to be resilient in the situation that we are all in. Those that perhaps were lagging behind or being a little bit reluctant to use technology and to move with technology and some of the trends are likely to find themselves in a lot more difficulty at the moment. Businesses are certainly putting their operations into virtual space, into the cloud. Where they are doing that and where they can do it, at pace and to do it broadly for all of their workforce, then they're going to find that things will continue almost unchanged. However, businesses that are not able to do so are going to find themselves in quite a lot of difficulty. I know those are sweeping generalizations, but I think it's important that we see the kind of extremes of things. The third area I'd maybe highlight is the fact that because the workplace is in many respects off limits or closed or out of bounds, it is forcing strong collaboration. It is forcing collaboration in the tooling that's being used, and it's also bringing benefits, also in terms of protecting the workforce, but it's helping that more conversations are taking place than ever before using technology, whether that's chat function, whether it's virtual video connections like we're using today, whether it's using cloud out there, but all of those things are quite important. And maybe just a few statistics. Prior to the crisis, the UK was actually falling a bit behind some of the other European countries in terms of the adoption of cloud and computing software. Around 42% of UK enterprises were buying cloud computing services. But if you look at Finland, if you look at Sweden and Denmark, then they are 65, 57, and 56% respectively. So I think what we're going to see is many more businesses in the UK and elsewhere looking at cloud, looking at digital solutions in order to continue to both operate and to try and grow and weather the impacts that are happening. And I think that's an impetus for digital adoption that's not going to be lost here. The last area I just wanted to touch on is the impact of COVID and maybe some other factors around the kind of underrepresented groups, whether we want to talk about women or the BAME groups or BLM, etc. But many of those groups were probably most at risk of suffering, the kind of economic, the health, the mental health impacts of the crisis. But there have been many studies that are showing that there are benefits to allowing products to be accessible to all and to be much more relevant to the society that they're trying to engage with. So I can see that strategic objectives are shifting towards the increased diversity and inclusion that's going to have to be kind of threaded in or tied into the economic recovery. And that's not just an issue of social justice, because it's something that will also help, I think, to increase the chances of recovery and help with a more successful and more equitable society generally. So businesses should use perhaps the crisis as an opportunity to not just rebuild, but to build back better, showing that access to all, benefits to all, the plurality of ideas and voices are actually going to be part of what happens. So maybe just a few quick points to try and sort of set the scene. And then if I come to you specifically to your question about COVID and return, the majority of businesses and employers, first and foremost, are concerned about the safety of their staff and their workforces. They're watching this very carefully. They're having to adapt to different regulations and requirements because, unfortunately, if you look across Europe and you look across the rest of the world, there is not one kind of approach that is the standard that is being applied to what happens in workplaces and offices and buildings and factories. Each government in each country is responding and taking a set of decisions that are associated with that. Everyone on the call will have their own view about whether that's good or whether that's bad or whether they're favourable or whether they're not. But businesses are having to watch, adapt, respond to that. And I think there's kind of three phases. First of all, there's a kind of shock and awe phase of what's happened and how do you deal with it and how do you respond. Then there is a kind of stabilization, and then there is a little bit more around the normalization, or how do you return, and what should you be doing. And I think businesses are at various stages on that, and we see different sectors beginning to open up. But there's all kinds of press, and there's all kinds of articles around leaders out there who maybe have taken what they thought was the right decision, but has turned out to be the wrong one, with regard to the treatment of suppliers or staff, or to be insistent on certain things, or to make some demands. And I think what we will see is, ordinary citizens, as well as unions and works councils, etc., all looking at the return to make sure it's going to be a sensible one and a protective environment for people to work. And of course, many of us are getting quite used, after nearly 5 months, to operate on a virtual basis, many from home, and that may continue. Some businesses are taking a lead by already stating that they don't want staff back until 2021, or until the end of this year, or until something changes. So I think we'll continue to see more of that happen. But let me pause there and take a gulp of water, and I'm sure there's some questions.
Yeah, Gary, we've got one question following on from that, really, in terms of what you might see as the long-term impact of the pandemic on flexible working and remote working options. You touched on technology there. It's a trend that has been talked about for a long time, and it was really quite fascinating at the start of lockdown how quickly companies managed to transition in many cases. So you're looking at some of the big players, the banks and so on, how they were able to continue without really any hiccup. But do you see, will the new normal look anything like the old normal when this finally settles?
I think that is a good dissertation question to try and answer. And I mean, I guess if we speculate a little bit, if you look backwards, then there was a period of time where a lot of the authors and the consultants and the analysts were talking about home working, and that was really all founded on the basis of additional flexibility. People could work a little bit from home, it would be healthy, they could maybe save a little bit on travel. And I'm talking now maybe about 15 years or so ago. In the recent time, that shifted again, and what we saw was many businesses bringing teams together into different kinds of space and offices that were designed for collaboration, so that teams could be together and sit together. Because again, there's a body of empirical evidence that is telling us that there's more electricity, there's more engagement. I don't mean electricity you plug in, but they're sparking off each other. There's more innovation, there's more ideas when people are together. And we saw some trends in office space where, the offices were being pulled apart, where spaces were being opened up, where the space was being used to allow people to be together. In fact, some of the trends even included kitchen spaces, where you could see teams that would not just make meals together or eat meals together, but they would make them and then eat them, and they were still in the workplace and they were still working. You have soft areas and coffee bars and center areas that were there. And now we have COVID, which in some respects is asking us to be socially distanced. And that's for sure going to have an impact on the way that work will be done. It's going to come really in two different flavors. One is from ourselves as individuals saying we want to work in some different ways and we want to be safe. But it's also going to come from employers who are going to have to respond to what those changes might mean. And that may be redesigning, the space, the offices, the reception desks, the cafeteria and cafe spaces. I was talking to some colleagues in New York quite recently where, there are buildings that are, 60, 70 stories high, and they're struggling with the position of how do you allow people to come into the office and then use elevators to get to their office and then work there, because the elevators are not built in a way that allow enough people to be in the elevator or the lift at the same time. So there's a lot of practicalities that have to be thought through. And then there's the interesting point that says how many people who are commuters and who may spend, in some cases, 2 hours each way on their journey to a workplace, are enjoying the fact that they don't have to do that. Will they enjoy not doing that, every day in the week or 2 days in the week? And then what about the whole sustainability and environmental aspects to things? We have another paradox creeping in there, which is, people would like not to travel. The air has definitely been cleaner in many cities through COVID. Yet people are now starting to think about the return. And so people are buying cars rather than wanting to sit in trains, or they're going to buy a bicycle so that they can commute. And that may be fantastic if you have wonderful weather outside, but it might not seem to be quite so fantastic, when you end up with a difficult winter. So I think there are many aspects of the future and office from a work standpoint that is a case of, on the one hand, it's this, and on the other, it's that. And these are paradoxes that don't easily reconcile, but there's most definitely a trend. The past was about flexibility and maybe allowing people a little bit more time and the use of technology. So if you had a laptop computer and Wi-Fi, you could kind of work on the road a little bit. It came a little backwards towards teams want to be together because they like social interaction, they like engagement, and they like the innovation that comes with sparking off each other. And now we have COVID saying, for a whole host of other reasons, we may require to be socially distanced. And I mean, it's exciting in a way because these trends are going to keep many people employed. I mean, the architects must be busy redesigning offices and the ergonomists around space and desks and chairs. But I don't think any of us would ever have predicted that we would kind of be in this situation. And if you are a property or real estate head of a business, you may be sharpening your pencil to say, do I really want to be spending this much money in this location on highly expensive real estate when perhaps the future doesn't need it? So I think there's a whole financial and cost line element to all of this that will come with it.
From that, Gary, there's a couple of questions here that perhaps in the remit of a company director looking at this. So one is asking, do you think that current office space then, that many businesses will be looking to sell that and permanently move away from a fixed location, maybe convert it into housing themselves or sell it off for that kind of purpose? And the other associated question is there a need then, you talked about the issue in New York for businesses that are high up in buildings. Is there a need for directors to look at the safety of their employees if they do come back to work, and whether or not, with limitations on who can access elevators and so on, there's in practical terms that business location still suits?
So I mean, look, again, you're on some great. These are super questions. I mean, the first is remember, particularly in European law and in UK law, employers, whether it's the board of directors, employers have a duty of care and a responsibility for staff, and so they are going to be exceptionally careful and cautious about the conditions under which they bring people back. And that's going to be very, very important. The question of whether the buildings and the structures are fit and right and appropriate for the future of the business is going to be a decision that each of these boards and directors is going to have to make, dependent on circumstances. You may find some are looking at ways to stagger staff, some looking at ways of keeping staff out for some times. Others may decide on locations because that's where their clients are. So you can't be distant from your clients, but I'm sure there are conversations going on about how to deal with client-facing and client-facing staff. You have challenges also around retail and around the high street when you look at that. And I'm sure there are many of us that are using, the online facilities to order things now to have those delivered. And while that may seem like a fantastic way for things to be handled in the current environment, it is having a body blow punch to retail that cannot compete with businesses that are online. So there's big trends around that. So I don't think it is an easy answer here. I suspect businesses are going to take a little bit of time. Some may be faster because they'll decide that cutting cost is going to be another way of protecting employment and protecting their business. So they may look at ways that they can cut costs and to find opportunities that perhaps are sitting there in terms of fixed space or fixed office capacity or leased space, etc. But I think each of the businesses are going to have to kind of figure that out for themselves and decide on what makes the most sense. But right now, I would argue that everything needs to be on the table and nothing's off it. And it needs to be a creative period of thinking about what can happen here.
Another question here is, do you foresee that this trend will lead to a transition to accelerate offshoring and the move of highly skilled white-collar jobs in the long term to new locations? Is that a trend that you would anticipate?
I mean, these are trends. If you go back again a little bit in time, these are trends that have been in place for around 15 or 20 years, which is the invention of services and the outsourcing world. What we see now are second and third generation outsourcing, and over a 15 or 20 year period, businesses get smarter and smarter and learn more about that experience and what makes sense. So there's definitely some evidence that has seen some businesses move their work to different locations. And there's a whole debate around that. In some cases, it can be about moving them offshore. Then you also will hear the expression nearshore, which is maybe not moving them out of the continent, but keeping them a little bit nearer. And there's also a trend where you will start to see some businesses that are actually repatriating business and skills and work. Some of that is also happening, by the way, if you look internationally and at the geopolitical scene around the US market, where the President Trump has been a big advocate for the US, and so has been pulling businesses and jobs up on looking for, the investments locally and in jobs in America. And I think some of those trends are evident in other parts of the world as well. As you see, experience being gained and decisions being made around, the skilling. So access to skills to me is always quite important. Depends whether you're a local business, whether you're a national, an international, a multinational, a global business, on how you want to think about labour and your skill pool. If you're a big global business, you see the market as a global market, and you would like flexibility to move wherever you can, and to look at the ways of doing that. But the other thing too is that countries need to think about their skills base, their education, to keep that high in order that it's attractive to employers. And then remember, everything is about price. And so when you start looking at the price in different markets in different countries, then prices invariably will go up. And so some of the markets in Asia or in India or in Eastern Europe, etc., are actually, tending up, which may make the cost different when you come to look at where to place your business in maybe the next cycle. So I think there's quite a lot of elements in there, to think about, when you're looking at that question.
You touched on there the impact of technology, and I know that artificial intelligence is another area that is having a huge impact on the world of work. I guess in some ways we've talked about there that some of those trends up to now might lead for businesses to be keen to move jobs back onshore and to be seen to support local employment and some of those trends that you mentioned. But I wonder that there'll be cost benefits potentially through the that out against governments and businesses wanting to protect jobs at the moment. How do you see the general push towards the introduction of artificial intelligence in the world of work with COVID? Is it accelerating or kind of acting as a block?
So maybe, let's maybe try and unbundle, artificial intelligence just a little bit. So, artificial intelligence, I prefer to use the term augmented intelligence, because artificial, suggests, something that is simply, going to overtake, mankind. And there are a number of people who subscribe to that kind of thinking. But I think if we get into the kind of technology, and maybe I keep it relatively simple for my benefit here, then technology, computing capability is good at doing some things. And human endeavor and human beings are good at doing others. And so the combination of technology and human endeavor is likely to be far more productive than thinking in terms of artificial intelligence. And by that, I simply mean technology is very, very good at dealing with data, massive amounts of data, and at seeing patterns in data, and at doing algorithms and working through things at huge speed. Human beings, on the other hand, are particularly good at judgment and at empathy. And so I think the combination of these things makes sense when we come to outcomes and decision making. The technology of AI and augmented intelligence is still in its infancy. So we're still in the beginning. But there are great strides being made forward in it and lots of experimentation. But most of this is associated with the data. And if you look at what is actually happening around data, then about 80% of the world's data is regarded as dark data. It sits within the confines of businesses or governments or financial institutions, etc. And as ordinary members of the public or as ordinary citizens, we have absolutely no access to that. And what these businesses are looking to do is to find ways of using the rich and deep data that they have, either in a way that they can monetize or in a way that is going to continue to give them a competitive advantage over everyone else. Everything else, the kind of other 20%, is stuff that you can access through your searches and your search engines, and it's data that's kind of freely available. So all of the real money, opportunity, advancement is really in the area of data. And when you take a few steps in here, it also starts to get a little bit more difficult, because there are questions about who has the data, who owns the data, what are they doing with the data, who will have access to it, are they being transparent in the algorithms that they use with the data, etc., etc. And you can see lots of debate going on in the press and in the newspapers around a number of the big companies, the FANG companies out there, and the big data companies, about what they've got, what they do with it, how they protect it, etc. What I do know is that certainly on an individual basis, I was always brought up, I'm old now, but I was always brought up to be very judicious about your information and your data, and to store it very carefully, and not just to give that information away to everyone. And if you look at what we do on technology, information that's collected about the apps we access, the pages we access, the buying that we do, the pages we look at, etc. There are huge amounts of information about us out there. I think I'm much more concerned about the safety, the protections, the security, the safeguards that are in there, the transparency of who has it and what they do with it. And these are the areas that I think are going to be very important and very significant as this technology continues to advance. And certainly if you're a business, you need to do your due diligence, because you don't kind of want to find out that your customer data or your critical data is available somewhere to someone else, and you didn't know about that, and you didn't, protect the data accordingly. So I think there's an awful lot in there that's quite important. And I also see that there's a kind of shift between kind of good tech and bad tech. And by that, I don't mean that there's guys with black hats out there and white hats, but simply some of the technology and some of the technology businesses are looking to be very open about what they do and how they do things. And there are others that are absolutely not. And again, there's a kind of caveat or caveat emptor on buyers. You need to be very careful about what's happening and what you do in there. And I think security will continue to be something that's absolutely critical. We've seen hacks happen in many places And we know that there is data privacy legislation, etc., that's being put in place to try to protect businesses and citizens in there and to deal with anyone that is out there. But, you know, in the old days, you know, if someone wanted money, they might have robbed a bank. Nowadays, most of the crime is going to be cybercrime, and that's where the security and the protections are really needed for us as individuals and also for businesses and governments, etc.
Thanks, Gary. We've got a couple of our questions coming in, one of which kind of leads on from that before we perhaps go down a slightly different theme. So just on that area around technology and augmented intelligence, do you see particular opportunities, or are there examples out there where that's being used to support diversity and inclusion in the workplace?
It has and it hasn't. I mean, it's being used in many of the HR areas because, you know, lots of data. If you think about organizations that are doing lots of recruiting, if you think about the online recruiting through things like LinkedIn and many of the other online, then they are using, you know, algorithms, and they're using information that is allowing you know, a lot of that data to be managed very quickly, and then it's starting to find ways of identifying profiles and identifying individuals and identifying likes. So there's an awful lot more pooling than there used to be, because data allows you to start seeing people as individuals. So instead of people simply being, you know, part of a grouping, you know, you can start to see people as individuals, like a class of one out there. And so I do see that these things are happening. But, you know, AI is being used in all of these places, not just in the D&I space, but in recruiting, in compensation, in ways where, you know, if you have particular skills, you may be looking at ways to encourage people to take, you know, more education, or to take education in particular ways. So you would start to push the learning and the education towards them because you have a better profile of what they are and what they do. And you can also use it to derive information about people. So, I mean, some of the analysis I've seen is analyzing personality or analyzing skills, and it can make some fairly accurate predictions based on the patterns of hundreds of thousands of people that it sees out there. But what I did notice in D&I space quite recently is, you know, a number of companies who've been using the facial recognition technology have now stepped away from that because they don't believe that that's a place where they should be using the technology. They don't think it's helpful, and certainly in terms of some of the recent things that have been happening, particularly with BLM in the US and then around the globe, you know, a number of the big organizations have stepped away from it. So yes, it's being used. It will increasingly be used. You know, if any of you have, you know, a Netflix account or an Amazon account, and you notice that they are recommending, here's another series for you to watch or another film for you to watch, that's all using algorithms to kind of intimate to you based on your profile and the data what kinds of things could be useful to you. So if you think about that as an application, think about how that can be applied in, you know, a work setting, about here's another job for you, here's another education course, here's a specific set of skills that would help you to get to a next level of qualification, etc., etc. Here's an employer that you've never thought about, but we're going to put them on your radar screen. You know, all of these things, I think, are going to be you know, ways in which the technology is actually going to help to make us better.
That's great, Gary. Thank you. The next question that has come up is saying that with work from home now being more and more a part of the permanent norm, how do you see this impacting on employment contracts for things like annual leave, medical leave, sick, if somebody's off sick but they're still in their place of work because their work is from home? What kind of issues do you anticipate that HR has to deal with?
I think, look, there's no question that as a function, HR needs to contemporize as well. I think if there are views and opinions that see the function of HR or people or human resources or whatever we want to call it these days as a policing function, then I think those days are kind of long gone. And, I can see the function transforming in many, many different ways. But I see it in this particular area being more responsible for enabling. So how do you enable people to work well and work better? Of course, there are still businesses that measure time and they associate what people do with the time that is being worked. But that's not really the space that I would say is going to demand an awful lot of creativity. If you think about ever more flexibility, ever more trust, ever more adaptability, then you can conjure up a future view that says, I want to have an organization and a culture that trusts the people who work here, that enables them to give of their best, to do that in ways that make sense for them, to personalize the way we support them and help them, because no two people are the same. And of course it will have impacts on things like employment contracts. If you are a trusting organization, then you maybe don't measure time at all. You simply have a contract in place with people and you make assumptions that they will give of their best and deliver in the way that they can to be productive to the organization and doing the right things. Conversely, if you're in an organization that doesn't trust, you're going to say, if I can't see someone, if I can't measure what they do, if I can't see the evidence of what they deliver, then how do I know? And, I was talking to a board a couple of months ago that was very fixated about performance management. I really want to go hard on performance management. I really want to measure everything here and make sure that everyone's delivering. I would say that there's probably a different way and a different view around what we'll be doing about performance and productivities in the future as well. So I think, enlightened future vision is enablement and what would a function need to do in order to support that. And a less enlightened view is a kind of incrementalism around we still want to find ways of knowing what you do and when you do it and how you do it and measuring you. Oh, and by the way, if you think about keystrokes, then, you can be tracked and AI knows what keystrokes that you are making and how much code you write in a day and probably can predict how much you'll do next. So I think organizations may need to be thinking differently. And it's not just that this is about future. COVID is part of it, a reawakening of the way people are feeling about work, employers, and culture. And I certainly am not someone who would subscribe to the kind of administrative and bureaucratic police force of the future. And maybe with 10 minutes to go, Ron and Andrew, I'd suggest what I would see being really important is, what is the future organisation going to be like? What's the soul of the organisation? Lots and lots of talk about leadership, lots of talk about values and about ethics. You know, will the future role of HR be, you know, the chief values officer, the chief culture officer, the chief ethics officer, or some combination of all of those things for the future? Will it be about the, you know, empathy that's needed with the workforce and treating people as individuals? And maybe my kind of last couple of points on this, because no one's asked about leadership yet, but I think leadership is changing as a consequence of this too, and a consequence of COVID. And I think I see perhaps 5 quick things that are going to be important in there. The first is probably around candor. This isn't rocket science, but it's just an opinion that, you know, with candor there is honesty, and with candor and honesty there's less ambiguity. So I think that's going to be an important leadership trait. Who doesn't want to have candor in leaders? I think they're going to have to think a lot about flexibility and adaptability, and less of the stick in the way that things are done. And when you're faced with a lot of uncertainty, you have to be decisive, but you also have to be adaptive and flexible so that you can shift to respond to what's going on around you. I think leaders are going to need a lot of the flexibility and adaptability. I think they're going to have to do a lot of listening. And this is being very difficult for people during this time, particularly if you're on calls like these every day and all day, every day. But it's not just about looking like you're listening. It's really listening to what people are saying and what they are talking about. And the biggest mistake I think you can see from leaders are pretending that you know more than everybody else, or you know more than they do. And that's not the case right now. And then perhaps the last 2 items I would give, and you could even put them together. The first would be empathy, and I touched on that earlier. But we've got to make sure that leaders are the kind of counselor in chief for organizations. Forget the hierarchy. That's not what it's all about. You need to really be quite natural and authentic in the way you're operating, and have empathy for the people that are around you and the situations that they're finding themselves in. And the last one, which I have no problem with as a Scot, but I don't see enough of it. Maybe I do in Asia, is humility. And, you know, as a leader, I think it's really important that you have humility. You know, they're often expected to deliver perfect decisions in every situation, but they're just as human and just as fallible as everybody else. So I think genuine humility is also a good thing to think about. You know. So just a little bit on leadership, since I hadn't heard it come up, that I thought might be quite useful before we run out of time there. But I'm sure there might be a few other questions.
Yeah, no, there's, I guess, a more operational question has come up, but it gives an opportunity for you to touch on some of those characteristics of good leadership around empathy and being good listeners to employees. But somebody's asking us about how will HR policies and communication have to change to anticipate and look after the mental well-being of employees as they are more focused on remote and home-based working and just living with the current pandemic?
I mean, look, it's a great question. And I think probably in the last few months, we've seen a little more around references to mental health and mental well-being. We've seen probably a number of people come out and talk about it and champion it. I think it's an area that is an emerging area, perhaps a little bit late for a lot of people, but it's an emerging area for HR. And I don't know, I can only trade a little bit on my own experiences, but there is such a thing as Zoom and WebEx fatigue. And it's a phenomenon. And, you know, the psychologists and the psychiatrists have been all over this. And they're talking about you having to be on screen all day, that you're very tired by the end of it. They're giving recommendations on what to do and how some people shouldn't be on camera all the time. Some people should take breaks, etc., etc. So I do think that we're going to see it. But here's the dilemma again. On the one hand, society and the world is shifting to be ever more open, ever more social. Social media, transparency about everything, getting all my data out there. Some people want to live every aspect of their life in public, and others don't. And for sure, there is now more understanding that it is not just about physical well-being. It's absolutely about mental well-being. And many of the colleagues on this call, I'm sure you read all the books about the sports coaches. I think there's even one of them I read a number of years ago that's called The Inner Game. And it talks about the mental dimension of sport and how, you know, there are many people who are very gifted in terms of their physical ability to play sport in particular ways, but it was the mental game that they had to concentrate on that led them to be champions. There are corporate athletes, there are business athletes, there are small business athletes. All of us are going to have to get smarter and wiser about this. But I think there's two responsibilities. One is most definitely with employers, and they're going to have to do more and think more, and their HR functions are going to have to respond better. And that is an area that will open up. And the second is with each of us as individuals, because we probably have never been in a position like this before when we may be asked or we may get to say more about what we would like or the way we would like it than we ever have in the past. And we may also want to stand up to say, you know, I'm not willing to do this, or I'm only willing to do that rather than this. So I think the dialogue is going to change a lot. And I can see an exciting future in the profession as things open up and as we shift from some of the past kind of areas of interest and areas and domains that were very important to some new domains that require new thinking and new skills and new ideas. And it's not going to be about, you know, the book of HR for dummies on how to do this, that, and the next thing. we actually need some very big thinkers to help us figure out what organizations and businesses of the future are going to be like. And the ones that you want to be part of. Because these days, we get a vote. I know there are impacts on employment, but on the other side of this, I know each of us wants to work in an organization that we identify with, that we respect, that has values that we want in an organization, with leaders that demonstrate and behave in showing those values every day. And that, to me, is where the future direction's likely to be.
Gary, thank you for wrapping things up so neatly, almost bang on time as well. That's a wonderful conclusion to give us. And picking up on your idea of the move towards HR becoming the ethical guardians for the organisation and among the leaders who nurture that going forward. And certainly, from our own perspective, I'm sure Andrew would agree here, as a university where we have many students who are studying specifically to qualify in HR. We have some of those sharp minds and new ideas that will help steer that path. So thank you for your time today and for your openness, as you mentioned, in sharing your thoughts with us. It's been fascinating, and I'm sure all the attendees will join with me remotely and give you a round of applause for your contribution today. If I can just say to everybody that if you've found the session really interesting, then do please remember that we have further sessions lined up. The next one is with Ko Chai, who's one of our alumni based in Hong Kong. It's actually next week on the 13th of August, and you'll see the link on social media, but we'll also send that out if people want to register for that session next week. So thank you again, Gary, for your time and contribution, and thank you to everyone who's attended. We hope you've enjoyed the session.